Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to this special event, Insights from a Selection of ESS Repeated Modules, which we're holding today as part of our ongoing celebrations to mark us passing the 20-year mark in terms of the start of the ESS and its first field work. Delighted to present 4 papers today from some of our most widely used and popular rotating modules. Each of the papers will last about 30 minutes and there'll be some time afterwards for some questions. So if you're watching this live and you'd like to ask the presenters any questions, you can post these in the Q&A facility. That's the best place to put them, and then we will get to them at the end of the paper, and I will filter them and put them to the speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first paper, which is from Anthony Heath and Eldad Davidov, both longtime friends of the European Social Survey. And this is reporting on the Attitudes to Immigration module, which is, like all the modules today, has been repeated in the life of the ESS. So I will immediately offer the floor to you, gentlemen.
Right. Is that time for me to start the presentation?
If you'd like to share your slides, Anthony, yeah, we'll just check that we can see them properly.
Right, we seem to have gone to the end of the slideshow.
That's fine. You can, if you want to click, maybe click on slide 1 or start from the beginning. Perfect. Okay. All yours, Anthony.
Right, and I'll aim to finish in half an hour. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be joining you. I'm joined today by Eldad, who is a member of the questionnaire design team, and our other colleagues were Rob Ford, Eva Green, Alice Ramos, and Peter Schmidt. So this was, we were a questionnaire design team for the Wave 7 repeat module on attitudes to immigration. Attitudes to immigration have been asked in the very first round of the European Social Survey, and it continues to be a topic of very great interest with major issues that have continued throughout the 20 years of the ESS's history. So there's still a great deal of, obviously, of free movement within the EU, growing demand for migrant labor, and due to aging population decline. Major factor of the demographic pressures in the Middle East and Africa, and climate change leading to increased forced migration. And we've also seen domestic issues in Europe with the rise of far-right populist political movements, many of which are very concerned about immigration. And of course, we've had various major flows of refugees, which have taken place since the Round 7 module. When we first had the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015-16, continual movements across the Mediterranean. And of course, we now have the Ukrainian crisis with a new flow of refugees, and who knows, the issues with the earthquake in Turkey may well lead to further crises. So migration remains as important both from public policy concerns, the sheer numbers of people involved, and its implications for European countries as it was back in 2002, at the time of the first round. So I've already mentioned that we've had detailed modules on attitudes to immigration in 2002. And then there was a repeat module in 2014. And we're planning a new repeat module for round 12 in 2025. And in between these three in-depth modules, there have been a number of core items on immigration which have been asked in every round of the European Social Survey. And I'll be talking about some of those results from the core modules as well as from the repeat items. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is to really focus on how European countries differ in their overall attitudes to immigration. I'm going to talk about the sorts of migrant who are more or less preferred, and to what extent this differs between countries. Is there a common pattern in European countries with the kinds of migrant they wish to accept, or do we find different profiles in different countries? Also going to talk briefly about the extent to which countries are internally divided in their attitudes to immigration, because the internal splits have had perhaps some of the most important political consequences. And then we will conclude with a brief discussion of our plans for the new repeat module, which will be fielded in round 12, and which will focus on the big issue of refugees. So let me introduce first the repeat module that we had in round 7, which is a repeat of the round 1 module, and which kept very much the same structure in terms of the kinds of topics that we covered. 2/3 of the items were repeated, so there's very considerable continuity. And both modules focused on general attitudes towards migrants, as well as to different sorts of migrants, focusing really on differences not between refugees and labor migrants, but between migrants coming from different parts of the world or from different ethnic and religious groups. Both modules also looked at some of the drivers of opposition to migrants. One major theoretical concern has been with economic threat, the threat that migrants may pose to people's chances of employment, their earnings, their opportunities for advancement, sometimes called realistic threat, and also feelings of cultural threat and the extent to which groups might sort of challenge and undermine the culture of the society. Running against those threats is the positive role of social contact. And we had a new set of questions on social contact in the round 7 module. And then we go back to more sort of distant causes or drivers, including the underlying socio-demographic and normative factors, the value orientations that influence how people feel, whether they feel threatened, whether they engage in contact. So I'm going to show in the next slide a model of this with on the right-hand side, the dependent variable, if like the outcome, which is opposition to immigration, and then the different drivers going from proximate ones. Subjective group size, for example, is a very good predictor that people who think there are a large number of migrants in the country tend to be more opposed. But then as we go across to the left, we go back to more distant drivers. So there's the symbolic threat and economic threat in the middle, but the effects of those can be mitigated by intergroup contact. And then we go back to the socioeconomic and normative bases of attitudes to immigration. And I'm not going to try and cover all of that and results, although we have in our publications. I'm going to focus on, first of all, how do European countries differ in their overall attitudes towards immigration? And so here we show the results for one of those overall indicators of degree of opposition or acceptance of migrants. And we've got in dark blue the results for round 7, and in light blue the results for round 2. And we can see that there's a little bit of change over time, but the general pattern of country differences is very stable across time. So we see a very clear picture, which has been confirmed by lots of other research, of the Nordic countries. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland tend to be the most favorable towards immigration. And then down at the bottom, we have Hungary and the Czech Republic, which have been in both rounds the least favorable countries towards immigration. There's quite a wide spread among the West European countries. And there's also quite a spread among East European, with Poland being relatively favorable, and Lithuania, for example, around average. But that's a quite major cross-national differences in overall favorability to the acceptance of migrants. So moving on then, that's just a kind of an overview of opposition. Is opposition the same, or favorability the same across different migrant groups? And in both rounds of the of this module, there were questions asking how favorable people were to migrants of the same race or ethnic group as that of the country of destination, a different race or ethnic group, poorer countries in Europe, and poorer countries outside Europe. And then in the round 7 module, we added questions on Jewish people, Muslim people, and gypsies, which, as you'll see, have given more a spread of answers. And so again, we find a overall pattern of preference for people from the same race or ethnic group, with some less favorability towards the different race or ethnic group, the third bar. That's very similar profile to the poorer countries in Europe, which got very similar proportions. Poorer countries outside Europe, slightly more negative. Muslims have more negative responses, and Roma and Gypsies are more negative still. So that's a general pattern which more or less holds true across European countries, as we can see from the next slide, where I've just taken a selection of these in order not to overload you with figures. But as we can see, if we take Sweden, Sweden is more favorable than the average, comparing with the highlighted figures in the middle, towards all the groups that I've identified here, the same ethnic group, poorer from Europe, poorer non-European and Muslim, so that the Sweden and Norway are substantially more favorable across the board with no real differentiation. We find that Spain and Hungary tend to be more negative across the board on than the average on with respect to all these groups. But then there are some significant deviations, and I've just focused here on the difference between favorability towards people from one's own ethnic group and to Muslims, with anti-Muslim sentiment has been a major concern within Europe. Not surprisingly, Israel stands out with the figures in the right-hand column are the odds ratios, which are a way of showing the relative strength of opposition as between same ethnic group and in this case, the Muslims. So a very big difference there, but we also see greater anti-Muslim sentiment than would be expected in Lithuania and Hungary. But interestingly, more favorable, highlighted in green, orientations towards Muslims in Spain, the UK, France, and the Netherlands, actually also Sweden. And that we think, although it can't be proved absolutely, it is likely to be a result of greater contact because of the larger Muslim populations in those countries. So this is going back to the point I made earlier, that contact may mitigate some of the opposition to migrants in general, or particular groups of migrant. So that it's not all just a pessimistic story of threat. Contact, which is increasing as immigration continues, so that people as they have more experience of meeting and getting to know minorities from the migrant groups, become more favorable as they see them. And it could be that some of the East European patterns reflect lack of contact, a sort of almost lack of knowledge about the groups and lack of understanding instead of understanding a kind of taking a more stereotypical view based not on experience but on, for example, media stories. So although the preferences are pretty similar across the board, across different countries, we do find somewhat different profiles, and strong pointer that social contact, meeting migrants, can ameliorate the negative attitudes that might otherwise be there. And then I next want to look at the question of the internal divisions. And here I cover a number of sort of demographic and socioeconomic factors that have been shown to be predictive of positive or negative attitudes. And so here we look at differences by education, income, migration status, unemployment, gender, religion, and age. And the big two are, first of all, education, that the highly educated graduates in particular tend to be much more favorable towards migrants than are people with low levels of education. There's also quite a strong relationship with income, with a slightly smaller effect, but a similar pattern. Of course, to some extent, that could be the case that, that advantaged groups in society, whether high income or highly educated, experience less competition from migrants who typically, although it's not by any means universally true, tend to be competing at sort of lower levels of the labor market. So these might be a reflection of not just of attitudes on the part of the highly educated, but just their experiences, that they're not in competition to the same extent. Age, though, is going to have a rather different explanation, where we find that young people tend to be more favorable to immigration than are older people. Since younger people tend to be active in the labor market, realistic threat is likely to impact on them more than people who are retired. And the interpretation of the age difference by most scholars is in terms of generational change, with older generations that grew up before, when countries were still relatively homogeneous ethnically, have less contact and less experience. So that whereas newer generations who've grown up in diverse multicultural societies are more supportive of immigration. So that's sort of the overall picture, but the interesting sort of subsidiary question is, do countries differ in the extent of their social divisions over immigration? And this is quite I think, a surprising but plausible story, which shows that some countries, I take Sweden, which was the most favorable, is nonetheless shows very high level of polarization, not the highest, but is internally divided. Whereas other countries, such as Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic, are not, which were much less supportive of immigration, are much less divided socially. Here, my criterion for division is the extent to which the highly educated and the less educated in each country differ in their attitudes. So it's based on education, which I chose obviously because it was the strongest, had the strongest effect on attitudes. So educational differences vary very substantially between countries. So we can think of some countries, such as the ones at the bottom here, Sweden, Austria, France, Slovenia, as being quite supportive, certainly in the Swedish and Slovenian cases, quite supportive of immigration, but even so quite divided internally. And of course, that can explain why such countries can still have radical populist parties who are anti-immigration, even though overall national sentiment is much more positive. So those are some results, particularly from the round 7 module, and some comparisons with round 1. I also want to look briefly at the core items in order to see how attitudes have changed over the 20 years, and particularly in the light of the refugee crises which occurred after our round 7 module. And this first slide shows changes over time in the Western European countries. Here we have quite a clear pattern of attitudes gradually becoming more favorable over time, which we saw on the very first slide, from round 1 to round 7. Sorry, round 7, yeah, it's 2014. But they've continued to become more favorable in Western Europe as a whole in the 2016-2018 European Social Surveys. That's more noticeable in the top chart, which is answers to a question on whether immigration is good or bad for the economy. Similar trend for whether immigration makes countries a better or worse place to live, with the proportion saying it makes it a country a better place to live, has been gradually increasing, 28% back in 2002 to 44% in 2018. Changes not so marked in the case of cultural life, and whether cultural life's been undermined or enriched by migrants. So again, the distinction between sort of the economic threat and the cultural threat comes out as quite important. That's the West European pattern, which is the majority of our countries. A rather different pattern in Eastern Europe, particularly after 2012 with the refugee crises. And we can see that to some extent that the surge in opposition was temporary and it sort of fell back a little bit, although yes, so it's still more favorable in 2018 than it had been when the European Social Survey started in 2000. But again, the cultural aspect, which had previously been more positive, showed a marked change in Eastern Europe after 2012 and became more negative and has stayed more negative. So that the over time patterns have been, while they've been generally favorable, the patterns have varied across European countries, and the issue of cultural difference, which perhaps just takes us back to the slide we looked at opposition to Muslims, has showed us a rather different trend from the economic threat one. So that and that again helps us to understand perhaps why right-wing populism has been able to win votes and places in parliaments around Europe. So concluding then, just want to talk briefly about our planned round 12 module. As I said, we're going to focus on refugees. We're also going to sort of extend the module, which also, I'm afraid, means cutting some questions, and we like our questions, we'd like to keep them all, but we want to include new explanatory measures, and in particular, we want to focus on humanitarian values and sentiments, which we've not really covered at all in the European Social Survey before. And we are also planning to include a new set of questions on looking at different types of the reason for migration. So the past modules have looked at countries of origin and then at sort of ethnic groups or religious and groups who are migrating. This time we're thinking of looking at the drivers of migration, and do attitudes differ depending on whether, as with the Ukraine refugee crisis, people are driven by war? How does that as a driver compare with persecution for your beliefs, factors such as climate change, which is likely to become a more important issue in the future, or straightforward poverty and disadvantage? So essentially, we're going to look at the same broad model, but to add in our outcome measure range of attitudes to refugees. We're going to add another variable on sympathy for different types of cause, climate change, war, poverty. And we're going to look at some of the values and value orientations that might influence how people feel about refugees in particular, as opposed to labor migrants, looking at humanitarianism, and also want to look at authoritarianism and nationalism, which are very important in understanding the rise of right-wing populism. So that really concludes the talk. I'm more or less kept to time. And I look forward to comments and suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. That was super interesting. It's also nice to get a sneak peek at what you've got in mind for the next round. That all looks extremely interesting. I'm sure there'll be a challenge for you in terms of squeezing all your items into your space. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'll put to you. So the first one from Isabella, which is something that was in my mind, actually. She asks, are there studies in the field that relate to attitudes towards immigrants contingent upon the number of immigrants in that country and the number of migrants of country nationals abroad? So I guess particularly in the Nordic context, which have traditionally been sort of quite low, immigrant. Can you shed any light on that?
Well, there certainly is a literature. I don't know if Eldad wants to come in.
There's certainly literature on the relation between the number of immigrants perceived and objective and the attitude towards immigrants. For example, Semyonov and Gorodzewski looked at this in several studies, and they see that the subjective number is very relevant. Regarding the number of nationals abroad, I'm not aware of any studies. Here again, one could think about subjective number and objective number, but as kind of if we are allowed to go to other countries, we should also be open to get people here in our country. This could be an interesting mechanism. I'm not aware of this element, but maybe someone else from the audience. Yeah, but for the first element, there are definitely studies on number of immigrants.
Thank you, Eldad. There's another question in the Q&A. You already sort of gave us a little teaser for the next repeat. The question here is, do you have any expectations regarding the reasons for immigration and the origins of immigrants variables that you're going to include? Namely, for example, Ukrainian refugees might be more accepted than Syrian refugees, though in both cases they are fleeing from a war.
Eldad, do you want to, while I collect my thoughts?
If you like to be first, no problem. I can also say what I think, whatever. Because there are some studies like showing that when one uses a question like, are the immigrants bogus or not, there are definitely more positive attitudes towards refugees who are not bogus, or really coming for good reason. We also have an expectation that the Ukrainian immigrants would be much, or refugees would be much more positively accepted than from other countries. So here, the element of racism could play a role, which we had also in the previous module, and we are considering how cultural and biological racism may be also included here. These are just my spontaneous thoughts, but Anthony, you surely have some ideas.
Yes, well, it's certainly the issue of Ukrainian and Syrian refugees both fleeing war is one we certainly want to address. And we may actually try and do a survey experiment to look specifically at that question. And I think there's an interesting issue here. And from what we know already, we would expect that groups that are Muslim fleeing war will get a more negative response than non-Muslim groups. So in a sense, that would be, if you like, the default finding, that the attitudes that we saw in general would carry over to refugees. But there's another possibility, and particularly, I suspect, among people who score highly on humanitarianism, who, where one of the fundamental ideas behind that concept is sort of, we're all humans, we're all, we're all entitled to the same equal treatment and the same human rights. We may find that certain sectors of the population do not distinguish in the same way as the overall average. So it could be, and it'd be interesting to see, and it's a research question for us, whether this is a general phenomenon that Muslims, whether they're refugees or labor migrants, are less welcome than Christians or people from European countries. But maybe humanitarianism will lead to some narrowing of the gap. And so we may get, we may see bigger differences in attitudes towards Muslim or Syrian and Ukrainian labor migrants than we do to refugees. So I would, yeah, it's an interesting research question. I don't know the answer yet, but I think there could be a flattening of the opposition towards Muslims. But we'll have to wait and see.
We shall. Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for kicking us off this afternoon. We're now going to move on to our second presentation of the afternoon. So I'm going to welcome Mónica Ferrín and Hanspeter Kriesi. I can see Hanspeter in my window. And they will be talking about the understandings and evaluations of democracy module, which was fielded in round 6 and repeated in round 10. So I now give the floor to you both.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to tell what we did in this module, repeat module in 2010. I will tell you a bit about the challenges we had on measuring populism, and I think Hanspeter will tell you a bit more about how the different items built together perform different scales of democracy. So just to put you into context, why we decided to present both on Europeans' views and democracies on democracy, both in round 6 and round 10. By round 6, you probably heard quite a lot of things about crisis of democracy, and this was a bit the driver of our proposal, to really check whether indeed Europeans thought democracy was no longer the best system ever. In 2010, in addition of all the many crises that we had before 2012, there were many other different crises that were important challenges to democracy, but especially I'm introducing it because I will tell you a bit more about the populist model of democracy there. There were new political players into context that were managing lots of people's discontent against their democracies. So apart from all this different crises, we had now new players that talked in the name of democracy in 2010. So repeat module tries to echo these different crises, but also introduces something a bit new, directly related to these changes in the political system. So to tell you a bit about what we measure in the module on democracy and then the repeat module, this is the original framing we had in 2012. So there was two basic innovations in the module. The first one is that we did not ask about democracy in the abstract, but we asked about specific components of the concept of democracy. You can see them all here. This is participation, competition, freedom, horizontal accountability, multi-level democracy, representation, rule of law, vertical accountability, responsiveness, populism. Sorry, this is next slide. Equality and regime support. And with these different components, we expected there were different underlying models of democracy, and this is what Hanspeter will show you, I think, later on in his presentation. What is new in round 10 as compared to round 6, because I tell you this is what the theoretical frame for round 6 is, that we introduced a new model of democracy, which is supposed to measure alternative visions of what we have called so far the populist model of democracy. Of course, this is we call it so far populist model of democracy. I don't know if this is the way we should continue calling it, but this is how we framed it so far. And we introduce then a subdimension of populism to incorporate these alternative visions of democracy. And we expected, in theory, the populist model of democracy to correlate positively with some of the dimensions we had and negatively with some other of the dimensions we have. In practice, we will see this is not the case, and Hanspeter will show you how it works. But in any case, we wanted to capture whether indeed people's views of democracy had incorporated this populist message of democracy. The second important aspect we introduced in round 6 and obviously in repeat module round 2 is that we ask about two different aspects, not only about democracy in general and specific attributes, but we try to understand what democracy ought to be for the people and what democracy is. So we ask people about their ideals of democracy, the meaning they attribute to democracy, and how they see their democracy's functions. We ask them to assess how each of the specific attributes of democracy is performing in their own country. So how, with this frame in mind, have we dealt with this very challenging indeed alternative model of populism? So to start with, we depart from an additional conception of populism, which is, I think, now the mainstream, but there are other alternatives for this operationalization of populist model. We depart from this additional conception of populism as a set of ideas in which there are two main aspects, which is the contradiction between people-centrism versus anti-elitism. And what we thought was underlying this contradiction is important trade-offs that underline the very concept of democracy. So the first one underlying this model of democracy is the contradiction between the will of the people and versus checks and balances. So this idea of populism, that people is at the center of whatever happens, is very much against horizontal accountability in a democracy. So we believe that populist model of democracy should reflect this contradiction between will of the people and checks and balances. There's also important contradictions with the liberal democratic model underlying this people-centrism, which is that implies different models of representation, where one of them is really people-centered, really representatives have to act as trustees, whether the other implies that representatives have to act as delegates. So these were the main contradictions we saw inherent to this ideational conception of populism, which we try to reflect in our measures of populism. So far, there have been many attempts to measure citizens' populist attitudes. I won't go into detail here, but they have many important attempts to really understand whether people are supportive of populist attitudes or not. Sometimes there is agreement between their findings, sometimes there is not agreement between their findings. There is, most of them share the main attributes, such as those I mentioned above, as people-centrism versus anti-elitism. Some other studies add additional dimensions to the concept of populism. Our worry was, when we tried to formulate this populist model of democracy, was whether we could equal citizens' populist attitudes with preferences for a populist model of democracy. In other ways, what we were wondering, if I am a populist, I hold populist attitudes, why I support a populist model of democracy. And we thought it was not exactly the same to have populist attitudes and to support a populist model of democracy, although it was quite difficult to disentangle. So how have we dealt with this difficulty? The first one, and very obvious, is that we ask about democracy. That might sound very obvious, but generally previous studies did not do the link between specific the concept of democracy and populist attitudes. So since we have different, these two different aspects we ask about, we ask how important the specific populist attribute is for democracy, and we ask also to what extent this populist attribute applies in. And as I said, we try to operationalize these two main contradictions. We try to operationalize what we have called the unrestricted popular sovereignty, so people-centrism versus checks and balances, which is basically the will of the people cannot be stopped. This is how we operationalize this concept. And we try to operationalize the contradiction between people versus elite. And the way that we did it, what was this, was with the wording, the views of ordinary people prevails over the views of the political elite. Our theoretical as well as methodological expectations were that the two measures were correlated, and that a strong populist Democrat would give value 10 to both items. And this is something Hanspeter will explain in a while. In addition to that, we introduced in round 10 an additional question in which we respondents to choose which one of the models of democracy they would prefer. And by meaning which one of the models of democracy, that means that we included the second item, the people versus elite item I just presented to you. The views of ordinary people prevails over the view of the political elite as a category to this fourth choice item, so that people could really choose what is the model of democracy they prefer. In doing this, apart from the theoretical challenges and the challenges of transforming such difficult concepts into something we could measure, we had other limitations, which is that we only could use 2 items, and populism is a multidimensional concept, so it was very difficult to come with only 2 items that could summarize all these different aspects that are implied under the concept of populism. We had to make choices on that. Another important limitation is the order effect. Since this round 10 was a repeat module, we could not move the items from a previous module, and so the 2 populist items come at the end. So since people have been answering that everything is very much important, and we ask about important things about democracy, such as free and fair elections, the previous questions, it might be that people just tend to score high as well in these items because of the order effect. We took our decisions on the specific wording of the items I presented you based on pre-test and the pilot. This is the basic decisions were based on both of this. And for example, we introduced in the items the concept political elites instead of elites, after having probed different options, because this was really capturing what we were aiming at, we felt, after the cognitive interview, pretest, and the pilot. Or, for example, in the other items, unrestricted political people sovereignty, we only use cannot be stopped without imposing by a specific institution or whatever, since we found out that there was no way we could compare across different contexts if we really imply something very much institutional in this item. So just to give you an overview of how this looks like, these are the mean for the importance and the evaluation items of the 2 populist items we could include in round 10. The first one is about the people versus elites, the anti-elitism item, and the other one is on the unrestricted will of the people. The darker gray is an importance, and the lighter gray is an evaluations in both graphs. You see that people tend to be quite supportive of these different dimensions of populism. It's not that they reject them at all. So the mean is above 7 for both items, which seems to mean that they do not see a contradiction between the populist model of democracy and the other models of democracy, as Hanspeter will show you in a while. And as for the evaluations, there is very much variation across the different countries, as you can see, with the habitual suspects having much better evaluations in general than other countries, such as Finland or Norway or Sweden, for both items. If we look at the core of democracy, or the question in where we obliged respondents to choose what was the main conception of democracy they like, the picture is a bit different. Here you see that Hungary is the country where the highest percentage of people chose populist item as the most preferred conception of democracy, whereas Germany and Finland are towards the end. But you see again, there's quite a lot of variation across countries on this item. Just to put it in comparison with the other things we measured in 2010, you see in red the two populist items and all the others in the same chart. You see that the main for the will of the people cannot be stopped is 7.9 and 7.4 for the anti-elitism item, which is pretty close to the item we use to measure direct democracies. It doesn't have the final say on political issues by voting directly in referendum, or to items we have to measure social democracy, so just the government takes measures to reduce differences in income levels. And you see that this is one of the worst evaluations. The views of ordinary people prevail as compared to all the other items. But on average, there are not so much difference on how people evaluate the populist dimension of democracy and how much they want of populist democracy. Just to show you a bit about how these populist items relate to other variables, which we know from literature are supposed to be related to it, which is a sort of construct validity of how well these items are related to populist attitudes. So you'll see in a minute a figure which shows as dependent variable the two items I just show you, and as independent variables, political trust, external political efficacy, and conspiracy belief. Two of them are part of the core of the European Social Survey, where the conspiracy beliefs come in as a separate module. And if you look at the figure, which I'm showing you, this is all in the expected direction. So the higher a person perceives that the system is willing to listen to her, the less likely that she will endorse the populist items. And the relationship is a bit weaker for trusting politicians, but it's also significant for conspiracy. So the higher, the more you adopt conspiracy beliefs, the more likely you have to endorse populist items of democracy. So it seems that the items at least relate to what they should relate, on the model of democracy, the populist model of democracy is related to the standard or the classic antecedents of populist attitudes. Now, what about the context? What you see in the figure is the relationship between the voucher of populist parties at the country level and the endorsement of one of the items of populist unrestricted will. You see that there is a positive relationship, but it is not significant. So the presence of the stronger presence of populist parties in a specific country is not directly related to the endorsement of populist democracy among the population. There is not institutional learning generally extended among the population. There is a relationship yet on whether one endorses the populist items, that this is the populist scale that will be presented by Hanspeter in a while, and the party voted for. So if someone voted for a party from the populist right or the populist left, he or she is more likely to endorse a populist model of democracy than if someone did not vote. Of course, this is all endogenous, and this aims only at being descriptive, but it's only to show that there might be a relationship between vote and conception of democracy, maybe because people feel their conceptions of democracy are better represented by these parties. So to summarize very briefly, sorry. And what I just told you, we have in round 10 introduced new items on populist democracy, which was not at all an easy task. In many hours of discussions to try to find out what fitted better what we had in mind as a conception of populist democracy. And we see that support for populist democracy is relatively high, and there is apparently no contradiction between populist democracy and other types of democracy. We see that apparently there's no direct effect of the context, but when we think, for example, on the figure where Hungary has the highest percentage of respondents who chose democracy as a preferred model. In fact, if I use this as a dependent variable, we can see a relationship between vote share and preference for a specific model. For some contexts, it might work. This is something that we need to dig into more in depth. And it seems that the model fits with populist vote. But data have become available only very recently, so I hope that more is to come in the following months on this and other aspects. And now I think Hanspeter has lots to tell you on how it relates to other items. I cannot hear you.
Hanspeter, is it possible to put your presentation into, is it presenter mode? Or so as at the moment we see the next slide as well as the current one. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're still on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Now we hear you and see you perfectly. Thank you, Hanspeter.
Okay. So what I shall present is changes in the structure of Europeans' view of democracy. And we have the advantage that we have just brand new data, the disadvantage that we have not complete data yet. So what I will show you is the comparison for 19 countries for which we have data on the ESS round number 6 and the ESS round number 10. Now I cannot advance yes. I will present 3 types of results: the structure of the basic model of liberal democracy, the structure of support for alternative models of democracy, and the preferred model of democracy, what Monica called the fourth choice question. Now, first, the liberal model. In 2021, we find the same hierarchical structure as in 2012 in each and every country for the basic model. And what does it mean, the same hierarchical structure? We have retained 6 items for the basic model, and we dichotomized each item at the maximum value. So the 10 means this item is extremely important for democracy, which we interpret as it is a necessary condition for democracy. And here you see the distribution. You see the most supported item, the item that is most seen as extremely important or necessary for democracy, that is equality before the law, followed by free and fair elections. These are the 2 basic items. Then comes free media, the possibility to throw the rascals out, minority protection, and alternative offers by parties. And you see two things. You see that the distribution in 2012 and 2021 are fairly similar. So we have a stable structure of support of these items. And the other thing which you do not see, but which we have tested, is that the more demanding items, like alternative offers, presuppose the positive support of the less demanding or more popular items like equality before the law, and that is the hierarchical structure. Now, here you have the distribution. We just added the 10s together for the 6 items, and you see there are in 2012, there are 21.4% who don't support any item as extremely important. In 2021, they are 19%. So these we will call the uncommitted Liberal Democrats. The average intensity of support is 2.9 in 2012 and 3.0 in 2021. And what you see again is a stable, widespread support for liberal democracy beyond the minimal requirement. So there is not very much change. However, having said this, the overall stability hides variation across countries. And here you see that on the one hand, there are countries like Italy, where the share of committed Democrats has substantially decreased. There are minus 20% of committed Democrats in 2021 in Italy. There are also more than minus 10% committed Democrats in Hungary. On the other hand, you see that committed Democrats have substantially increased in a country like Portugal, also in Finland and some other countries. Now, the second topic I would like to briefly address is the structure of the different models. And as Monica already said, we have the liberal democratic model, we have the social democratic model, the direct democratic model, and the populist model. And the liberal democratic model has an electoral and a liberal component. And what you see is that all models are positively correlated with each other. Also, the populist model is positively correlated with all the other models, which we interpret as meaning that these models are complementary. They are not substitutive to each other. Now, based on these different models, I have created a typology which goes from uncommitted Democrats to populist Democrats. The uncommitted Democrats endorse none of the liberal items, of the liberal democratic items. So these are the 19% which you saw before. Then there are 5.8% electoral Democrats which endorse electoral democracy, but not the liberal democracy. This is a theoretically important group, but it is relatively small, as you see. Then come the weak liberal Democrats, the strong liberal Democrats, the direct Democrats who support at least the weak liberal democracy plus direct democracy items, the social democrats, which are at least weak liberal democrats, but also support both social justice items, which we have. Then there are the multifaceted Democrats, which are at least weak liberal Democrats plus social Democrats plus direct Democrats. And finally, the populist Democrats who correspond to any of the committee types, plus they also endorse 2 populist items, which Monica presented to you. And you see there are relatively many populist Democrats if we define them in this way. Now, here I have the average expectations by type of Democrat, the number of supported models. And what you see is that the multifaceted and the populist Democrats support on average the largest number of models. So the populist Democrats are, to some extent, the broadest types of Democrats. They are not only populist, but they are also social, direct, and liberal Democrats, which is somewhat surprising and which leads to a specific interpretation of populist democracy. In the literature, there are basically two ideas about the populist democracy. On the one hand, there is Urbinati or Jan Werner Müller, who say populist Democrats are illiberal Democrats. On the other hand, there is Margaret Canoven, who says that populist Democrats have a redemptive vision of democracy. They expect everything from democracy. They seek salvation through democracy. And as you see in our data, the redemptive vision corresponds better to what we find than the vision that populist democracy is an illiberal democracy. Here I show you the change in the support of the different models per country. And on the horizontal axis, you have the changing share of uncommitted, on the horizontal, I can't see it. On the horizontal axis, you have the changing share of social and multifaceted Democrats. And on the vertical axis, you have the changing share of uncommitted Democrats. And you see at the extreme, there is Italy and there is Portugal. In Italy, you have a strong increase, as we have seen, of uncommitted Democrats, but this goes together with a decrease in the share of multifaceted and social Democrats. And in Portugal, it's exactly the opposite. You have an increase in an increasing share of social and multifaceted Democrats and a decrease in uncommitted Democrats. So there is seems to be a trade-off between uncommitted and very much expecting, aspiring Democrats. The third type of result refers to the preferred model, the forced choice question. And you see that if you force people to choose between the different models, the largest group chooses the electoral model. And then the smallest group chooses actually the populist model. While populists expect everything, they are not necessarily preferring the populist aspect of democracy. Now, I don't have much time. What I want to show you to conclude is the relationship of the different types of models to questions which have generally been asked about the importance of living in a democracy, and to a question which refers to the acceptance of a strong leader who is above the law. This is an item we have introduced to measure to what extent authoritarian regimes are accepted by Europeans. And what you can see is that the uncommitted Democrats are the most susceptible to choose the authoritarian item, and they are the least supportive of the question, how important is it for you to live in a democracy? On the other hand, the strong liberal Democrats are the least authoritarian and the most supportive of the general question about living in a democracy. you see that the more demanding Democrats, like the direct Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the populist Democrats, are actually also more susceptible to autocratic ideas than the strong Democrats. But overall, Europeans are very little supportive of the idea that there should be a strong leader above the law. To summarize, there is an overall stability of democratic expectations. If anything, Europeans have become more pragmatic Democrats because they have become stronger liberal Democrats overall. There is variation by country. Some countries have become more disillusioned, Italy, I would say, and some have developed higher expectations, Portugal as an example. The various models of democracy are complementary, not substitutive. Populist democracy is the most demanding type of democracy, which corresponds to the redemptive vision of democracy of Margaret Leuven. More demanding types of Democrats are often also strong liberal Democrats. So the different types overlaps, and depending on how you operationalize, you get different results. The autocratic temptation is overall weak, if anything, and it is most widespread among uncommitted Democrats, not among populist Democrats. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hanspeter. Thank you to both of you, in fact. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm intrigued by the idea that that populists have got the highest expectations of democracy. I guess that would explain in many ways why they always seem to be quite disillusioned and disappointed. We have, there's one question for you. I think it relates to Monica's section, actually, from Isabella. It's about how the different evaluations compare. So she said, for example, the evaluation of direct participation as measured by a referendum is important, but it's evaluated low. But I think the point is here that a referendum is kind of a fairly objective measure, whereas I think she's arguing that the other types of evaluations are not based on such objective measures. Would either of you like to discuss the measures a little bit? It's about the equivalence of the different evaluations, I think.
No, if Monica, if you want to go ahead. Please go ahead.
You can go, Hanspeter. You were
okay. I mean,
you're as a Swiss.
No, as you saw, the evaluations always for all items fall short of expectations. So there is a big gap, not just for referendums. For every item, there is a big gap between expectations and evaluations. So the way democracy works in Europe is giving rise to a lot of, let's say, dissatisfaction. This is not specific to referendums. I mean, we have thought that there were several referendums which probably increased dissatisfaction, like the Brexit referendum, the referendum in Catalonia, or also referendums in Slovenia. But I don't think this is specific to referendums.
I mean, I understand here the concern of Isabella that it's much easier to see whether referenda are held in a country or not, that whether a government is accountable or whether elections are free and fair. But this is something we have dealt a lot, also because it was very difficult to translate the specific principles into something that people could observe in their daily lives and to feel. Still, there's quite a lot of differences, and if we have checked in previous round to the correlation between how people evaluate their democracy in the specific items and how experts do. And there's quite a lot of relationship on the specific dimensions. So yes, it is true that the task is very demanding for some of the the items, but still I think they're somehow aware of specific elements of each of the specific components of democracy, because it's not that they give the same evaluation to all of them. So there's some hint of how they capture what's going on in relation to each specific component of democracy.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Simon. Can we assume that populist Democrats are actually the most disappointed Democrats of all regarding current democratic institutions? And specifically, he said, did you look at that particular variable, the one in the ESS core, satisfaction with how democracy works in your country?
I don't think we can assume this, can we, Hanspeter?
It's an open question, but we do have the satisfaction with how democracy works in your country, and we plan to have a chapter in our planned book which deals precisely with this question.
Lovely.
So far, what we can say is not that, as far as I have checked, I mean, the data were released very recently, so we are still in the process of trying to understand what's going on. What I could say so far is that evaluations are not worse. The evaluations of the democracy module are not worse among the populists, or those who voted populist at least, and amongst the others. But this is all something we need to check still.
But I mean, the idea that populists are those who have a populist view of democracy and expect everything from democracy are easily disillusioned. This you can see in the case of Italy. I mean, the Italians voted in 2018 a populist government, and in the meantime, they are the most, the change in Italy to the detriment of democracy is the most pronounced, and they have been very highly they had very high aspirations in 2012, and now they are very uncommitted to democracy. So they did exactly the opposite of the Portuguese. Why this is the case in Italy is pretty obvious. The populists failed in government. Why the Portuguese react exactly the opposite way, this is, I think, more difficult to explain.
Thank you very much for your responses to those questions, and thank you for the people who posed the questions. We're now going to move on to our third paper of the afternoon. This comes from the welfare modules that were asked fielded in round 4 and round 8 of ESS. And so I'm going to look to introduce Bart Meuleman and Staffan Kumlin.
Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot, Eric, for the invitation and the opportunity to present some of our findings here. I will share the presentation with Staffan, so you will see him appearing somewhere in the middle of the presentation. And the point of departure of the presentation is the welfare attitudes modules. And a key idea here is that when we look at Europe, one of the key defining features of Europe is probably the social model that we have in this part of the world. So there is a lot of variety in specifics in European welfare states, but what all these welfare states share is that there is a comparatively quite extensive way of social protection, quite a bit of redistribution. And so the idea of these welfare attitudes modules is exactly to look at what people think and how they evaluate these welfare states in Europe, right? Now, what is an important point is that when we look over the past decades, that these European style welfare states, that they have been challenged through a series of longer term challenges. Think, for example, about the demographic change that is occurring in Europe already for quite a time. For example, aging of societies. The result is well known, is that the working population becomes smaller. At the same time, expenses for healthcare are increasing. And so this puts a lot of financial strain on the European welfare model. We also have trends like globalization, which means that our market economies are becoming more and more integrated globally. As a result, national governments, they are less in a position to increase taxation and to define the rules in their national boundaries. And again, this puts a strain on the welfare state. And we have a lot of other longer term trends like individualization, but they all challenge the welfare state. But on top of these longer term challenges, what we have also seen in the past years is that we have seen a number of consecutive crisis situations. And it seems a very long time ago already, but in 2008, we had a huge financial crisis, started as a banking crisis, but then spilled over into a true economic downturn and the period of austerity, right? A couple of years later, we had a refugee reception crisis and the long summer of migration. Then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the war in Ukraine. And so it seems like there was one crisis after the other. And this begs for the question, what does this do to the legitimacy of the welfare system and this European welfare model in the eye of the public opinion, right? So how do citizens think about their welfare states, and has this changed as a result of these longer term challenges on the one hand and these series of crises on the other hand, right? And so this is exactly the backbone of the repeat module of welfare attitudes. And the attempt was to get more insight in this kind of questions. Okay, I don't think I have to convince this audience that it's important to study public opinion, otherwise you would not be here in this session, I think. But this is even more the case when we study public opinion towards policies and, for example, social policy, right? And the reason is that there exists a complex relationship between policies that are implemented on the one hand, and on the other hand, the policy preferences, the evaluations that live among the public opinion. And there are at least two theoretical mechanisms that can help us to understand how policies and public opinion are related to one another. So on the one hand, you have something that is called policy responsiveness. And the idea here is that policymakers, that they respond in a democratic environment, at least, to what the public wants, right? So they are responsive to public opinion. And this happens, for example, through elections. The public votes for the political parties that promises to deliver what they want. But it also happens in a more you could say informal way, that probably policymakers, they are a bit afraid to implement measures that are not so popular among the public. But next to this policy responsiveness, we also have a mechanism that is called policy feedback. And the idea here is that policies that are implemented, they are not just the results of what the public wants, but they also shape what the public wants, right? So if you have a particular policy that is implemented, this gives particular cues to the population. It defines problems. It tells the population what is important and what not. It uses particular categories to talk about problems. And in this way, it creates this kind of feedback loop. And so the policies, they are in a complex way connected to public opinion. And so if we want to understand how the policies develop, the policies that guide our lives from the cradle to the grave, then we also need to understand the public opinion. And this is what these welfare attitude modules try to do. Okay, what I will try to do together with Staffan in this presentation is to give you a bit of a showcase of research that has happened using these modules. And I think it's probably a bit more eclectic than the previous presentation. It's less of one single research agenda, but more a collection of different studies that have been done using the ESS data. But before we dive into the results, I also want to talk you briefly through the background of the module and the multidimensional approach that is implemented in the module. And then we will present a series of selected findings on different topics such as welfare criticism, welfare chauvinism, dissatisfaction and political distrust, support for the basic income, and support for social Europe if time permits. Okay, but let me start with the background of the module. In the introduction, I tried to stress that it's important to study public opinion on social policy and on welfare state and redistribution. Of course, before the ESS modules, there already was a lot of research going on this topic, right? So already for decades, there are surveys that contain questions like, are you in favor of a government that reduces inequalities by redistributing? Or do you think that the government should take an active role? And this is a concept that we call the preferred role of government. But so if we look at research previous to the ESS welfare attitudes modules, you see a very strong focus on this role of government. And this research, what it basically shows is that there is what Staffan Kumlin calls a bedrock of support for the welfare state. In Europe, we see that over time and over social classes across countries, there is a very high level of support for the idea that the government should intervene to guarantee a certain standard of living for its population. And so it's, you could say, a very optimistic and positive story, but at the same time, it's a bit one-sided because it has this narrow focus, this previous research on this concept of the role of government. And then someone like Wim van Oorschot, who is also present here today, said, well, isn't this research giving a too rosy picture of welfare attitudes? It could be that citizens are very supportive of the idea of an active government, but it does not necessarily mean that they are overall positive of the European welfare states. And perhaps, or probably, we need a more nuanced, a more multidimensional picture of welfare state attitudes. Because when we think about the welfare state is only one potential actor next to other actors like the market or civil society, family. And so you could wonder, what is the preferred welfare mix? How do citizens look at the different actors and their role in reaching certain goals together? But then we talk about certain goals, and the question becomes, what are the goals of the welfare state? Welfare states, they can pursue very different goals. They can try to combat inequality, but they can also strive for social security and a certain stability and standards of living. So not necessarily reducing inequalities too much, or they can strive for social inclusion of certain disadvantaged groups, right? Now, if we have an active welfare state, then the question becomes, on what domains will they be active? Like, what is the range of activities? And how intense is this activity of the welfare state? So the degree, and when we talk about range and degree, this is really close to this concept of role of government, the topic that has been studied in a lot of survey research already previous to the ESS modules. But it's not because people are in favor of an active government and a wide range and a high degree of government activity that they are necessarily positive about the outcomes of the welfare state and that they are necessarily supporting specific redistributional designs. So there might still be discussion about who pays for certain arrangements, what are the conditions to get access to certain benefits, and what about the implementation? Is it efficient? Is it effective? And are people happy about the consequences that the welfare state actually reaches? And so this multidimensional model makes clear that when we talk about attitudes toward the welfare states, it contains a large number of different aspects. And I think a major breakthrough of this ESS modules is that it really pays attention to these different aspects, and it allows for a more nuanced picture of what the public thinks about the welfare states. Okay, I'm now presenting the results of these two modules, and this might give the impression that I'm the leading force behind these modules, but this is certainly not the case. So I want to stress here that first module on welfare attitudes was already fielded in ESS round 4, so data collection of 2008 and 9. And at that point, the module was drafted by a team led by Staffan Kumlin. And this team also compiled a very interesting edited volume, Contested Welfare States, where you can find some of the main results of this first module. But then in ESS round 8, there was a repeat of this module fielded, 2016, 2017. And this design team was then led by Wim van Oorschot. And the idea at that point, how we sold the second module to the ESS scientific team, was that this would make it possible to study all kinds of crisis effects, because in 2008, what we had was this financial and the start of economic crisis. In 2016-17, when new data was collected, this made it possible to see how stable welfare attitudes were. And we have compiled, I think, an interesting book that you can see here on the slides on this question. I already have to give you a little disclaimer that this is not really a very easy question to answer. And the reason is that it's at the point of ESS round 4, 2008, 2009, at that point when most of the data was collected, the financial crisis already had started. So when you think about these two modules as a kind of experimental design, one pre-crisis, one post-financial crisis, it's not a perfect design because the intervention, the economic crisis, happened during the data collection rather than after the first data collection. But nevertheless, I think we have very interesting findings to show you. Okay, maybe a couple of words on the conceptual model before we dive into some results. So the idea is that we want to measure welfare state attitudes, and so multiple dimensions of it. So not only the welfare state scope and responsibilities, but also attitudes towards different target groups and receivers, support also for new types of policies like basic income and activation. And the idea is that this is a result, people's welfare attitudes of, on the one hand, the risks and resources they have at their disposal. So, for example, whether they belong to certain demographic risk categories, whether they live in precarious situations and make use of certain benefits, then this shapes their, you could say, more general predispositions, such as political trust and risk perceptions, inequality beliefs, but also shapes evaluations of the task performance of the welfare state. And this will then in turn lead to certain patterns of welfare attitudes. These are all individual factors, but of course the beauty of a data collection like ESS is that it makes it possible to put it into a wider national context and make comparisons across contexts. So we assume or work from the idea that all these links and mechanisms, that they are context dependent, so that they might operate differentially depending on the institutional, social, political, and economic contexts. Okay, this is roughly speaking the backbone of the ESS welfare attitudes modules. And so now I will jump to a couple of selected findings. Necessarily, this will be brief, right? I would like to start by saying something about welfare criticism. So you could say that it's a bit more of a novel topic compared to this role of government concept, because it focuses on the criticism that people voice towards the welfare state. But when we talk about these results, I think we should not forget that there is this bedrock of support. So people are really enthusiastic about the idea of a welfare state, but this does not make it impossible that they also have more critical perspectives, right? And so to look at welfare criticism, we focus on what we call perceived welfare consequences. How do people perceive the consequences that the welfare state generates? And you could distinguish three big types of welfare state consequences, right? So one type is the social consequences, and here it's the idea that the welfare states, they have particular goals, social goals that the welfare state strives for example, combating inequality, alleviating poverty. And so a criticism on the welfare state could be that it does not reach this social promise, right? But another type of consequence could be the economic consequences. And from a neoliberal perspective, often the criticism is voiced that a welfare state makes it impossible for companies and for business to survive because it puts a burden of taxation, and for that reason it harms economy. So these economic consequences are something that is seen as negative and is a point of criticism towards the welfare state. this economic criticism on the welfare state often resonates also with a moral critique of the welfare state. And it's the idea that when people make use of welfare benefits, that it makes them dependent on these welfare benefits, and that there is a kind of moral hazard that they become less enthusiastic to take responsibility for their own well-being, right? And so in the two ESS modules, there are questions trying to tap into these these three domains of welfare state critique, and the data allows us to study whether there are certain contextual effects, right? Whether particular context, national context, for example, institutions, economic context, have an impact of how critical citizens are about their welfare states. And what we find is that in countries with more extensive welfare states, that that people see more of the consequences, and they see more positive social consequences, but at the same time they also see more negative economic and moral consequences. So a more active welfare state that is spending more increases the positive points as well as the negative points, right? And so what we want to do with this repeat module is to see if the financial and economic crisis of 2008, whether this has changed how people voice their criticism towards the welfare state. And well, we started from opposing hypotheses. On the one hand, you could say that a plausible hypothesis is the scarcity hypothesis. And the idea here is that if you have an economic crisis and a financial crisis, this puts strains on the budget, makes it more difficult for companies to survive as well. And for that reason, this kind of economic criticism might become more persuasive and more popular, right? On the other hand, it's exactly in times of economic crisis when it becomes apparent that a welfare system is something that is really useful and necessary. And from that idea, we can derive the government protection hypothesis. Then when economic crisis hits, people see that they can rely on the welfare state, and for that reason, they become less critical of the welfare state. Okay, but what do the data tell us? What kind of results do we have? Well, let's first take a look at a table. Here in this table, you see the 6 items that are present in the both ESS welfare modules that tap into this welfare criticism, right? And so these 6 items, they have more or less the same format. It's every time a question: to what extent do you disagree or agree that social benefits and services, and then a particular consequence is mentioned. And so people have to say whether they see that consequence or not. And so, for example, one of the consequences is place too great the strain on the economy. It's not correct, it should be strain on the economy. Or cost businesses too much in taxes and charges, right? And so these 2 items obviously refer to the economic criticism, right? Prevent widespread poverty and lead to a more equal society. They resonate the positive social consequences, and then make people lazy and make people less willing to care for one another, refer to the moral consequences, the moral criticism on the welfare state. And without going into too much detail, what we can see in these results here is that people are more convinced of the positive social consequences of the welfare state than they are on the negative economic and moral consequences of the welfare state. Still, there is quite a substantial group of people that are convinced that these economic and moral consequences are there and are important. So it's, I think, an important point for study. Now, if we want to make a comparison over time, we prefer to work with latent variables instead of individual items to take measurement error into account. And on the next slide, I have a summary of some of the results, and it's very small print, so maybe you will see me leaning towards the screen more now. So here on this first graph, what we have is the perceived economic consequences, so an average over the 2 items. So it's on a scale from 1 to 5, with 3 as the midpoint. And we have per country the black dots, which is the data collection of 2008, the white dots 2016. And so we see the countries ordered by the 2008 score and also the change over time, right? And so what we see here is that there is some variation in the perceived economic consequences. A more in-depth analysis shows us that in countries where the welfare state is more active and spending more, that economic consequences are a bit higher. Also, countries with a more long-term unemployment, there people see more economic consequences, negative consequences. There are also a couple of outlying cases, you could say, like Hungary. But if we look over time, between 2008 and 2016, there is a small shift, but only a small one, right? And a bit to our surprise, you could say, is that people become less concerned or have become less concerned about economic consequences of the welfare states in 2016 compared to 2008, right? So it's more the government protection hypothesis than the scarcity hypothesis. We can take a look at similar graphs for the moral consequences and for the social consequences. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail here, but the main conclusion is that there is very little change over time. There is a good dose of welfare criticism present in European societies, but the economic crisis between 2008 and 2016 has not changed a lot, right? And so we could ask ourselves the question, why is it that such a big economic shift does not really alter how people think about this aspect of the welfare state? And a part of the answer could be found in the work of Christian Sterckle, where he argues that when we think about material vulnerability, it's maybe an objective given, but what really matters is the normative component, right? And it might have ambivalent effects, and people who are vulnerable in a material sense, it could on the one hand set off general distrust and create the idea that there exists this welfare dependency on benefit users, and then decrease support for an active welfare state. On the other hand, it might lead to system dissatisfaction and instigate feelings of egalitarianism, which then again leads to greater willingness for an active government. So it's not a very simple pathway from certain objective economic changes to welfare attitudes, and there's an ambivalent relationship. Okay, I'll leave it here for this component or this part of the selected findings. And now I would like to give the floor to Staffan.
Thanks, Bart. So I was asked to talk about a couple of really specific topics. One of which is what you see here, welfare nationalism, or chauvinism, as some refer to it as. Importantly, I haven't analyzed this myself, so I'll draw on this chapter from the book that was produced. A chapter by Maureen Eager, Christian Larsen, and Jan Meves. So next slide, please, Bart. Now, of course, one thing that really happened in Europe between ESS 4 and 8, in other words, 08 and 2016, was obviously the migration crisis around 2015. And here you see that this resulted, you probably know this, big increase in the salience of immigration issues. So in salience, in other words, increasing attention in the public sphere, with the result that more people find it an important issue, right? So I know this is an ESS. Well, if you can just skip back. Yeah, thanks. I know this is an ESS event. This is Eurobarometer data, but you see the percentage identifying immigration as one of the two most important issues facing the country. This comes from an open-ended question, Eurobarometer question. And you see this, just basically this big spike that I wanted to show you in 2015, preceding ESS 8 in 2016. So now we can go to the next slide. The interesting thing, though, is that despite this very big shift in issue salience right before ESS 8, there is mostly stability in welfare nationalism, as measured by this probably familiar question right here, which is about when should immigrants obtain the same rights to social benefits and services as citizens already living here. This is a pretty complex five categories that these authors recoded into three more manageable categories. And interestingly, you can just quickly scan this graph probably to see that the sort of sizes of these three categories are pretty similar in 2008 and 2016 respectively. The change that you can detect in some countries is actually a certain polarization, perhaps a little bit of a movement away from the mid categories in some countries, but certainly little in the way of, you know, any net shift in any sort of direction all over the continent. So next slide. And we go to the other topic that I wanted to talk about briefly. This is research that I've done myself. Again, a chapter with colleagues from this book. And this one is about public service evaluations and the relationship evaluations like that might have with more generalized political trust. If you want to read this particular chapter, you can go to SSRN and sort of look for me there, and you'll find a version of this chapter. So what we do here is that we study evaluations of public services. Are they associated with generalized political trust? Has that association increased in the years after the financial crisis? We know that it has in some places. So for example, studies that focus especially on countries that were hit really hard by the financial crisis and its aftermath, Greece, for example, there you find that the crisis, the massive crisis, maybe the massive austerity policies that have been implemented appear to have strengthened the link between how people evaluate public services, important areas of the welfare state, on the one hand, and political trust, more generalized trust in political actors and institutions on the other hand. Now, our question is, does that apply more broadly to the European continent? Next slide, please. So here you'll see that evaluations of public services in this case are tapped by two pretty familiar items, health services and education, and they have been in these ESS since the beginning, right? So these are part of the core module, but they're of course closely related to the welfare module kind of substance. And so for the purposes of this, we have made an additive index of these two. And if you look at the graph down there, the top line shows that these evaluations remained largely stable throughout. Political trust, which is the black line down there, another index is using this sort of same 0 to 10 metric. Political trust declined a bit initially, and especially and more so in the countries that were really hit hard by the crisis. But then political trust overall picked up later on, moving into 2016. And political trust is sort of an index of trust in parliament, politicians, and political parties. Just for comparison, you can see there in the line in the middle has to do with views on the country's economy, which improved over time during this period, as you might expect. So next slide. So the main question is there an association between evaluations of public services and political trust? Do we sort of get less political trust if public services, important aspects of public services, social protection do not work? Do people generalize somehow from these specific aspects of performance into broader orientations towards politics, democracy, and so on? This is a multi-level model, I should say. 180,000 individuals answering the ESS between 2008 and 2016. It's a 3-level model. So you have individuals nested in about 97 country years that are nested in 21 countries. Dependent variable is this political trust scale that I talked about. And the independent variable, the key independent variable, is public service evaluations, this index that I mentioned. So the yellow ellipse there, you find that there is a relatively strong association between the two. This fits other studies that are out there. So showing that if you plug a measure of this type into a reasonably well-controlled cross-sectional regression model, it's usually one of the more important variables, right? It's on par with things like education or how people evaluate the macroeconomic situation, for example. The other thing to note is a set of interactions with year dummies that show basically that this association remains stable in 2008, in 2010, in 2012, but then in 2014 and 16, it increased a little bit. It's not a gigantic increase by any means. It's more like 10 to 15% stronger or something like that. So next slide. Well, this is not so important. It's just illustrated what I just said. We can actually go to the next slide again. This is just breaking down the same thing by country. Of course, things, these trajectories become more complicated when we look at them by country, and we can scratch our head all day long about these patterns, but we're not going to do that now. We don't have time for that. But the thing to note, though, I think, is that these associations exist pretty much everywhere. They're almost never zero in any of the 97 country years that we've looked at. There's big variation across countries, for sure, and across time. These effects tend to be stronger in larger welfare states. Just for fun, I circled the Norwegian case there, which gets a gold medal for having the strongest association between these performance evaluations of public services and political trust. So there's country variation that you can make sense of, but maybe the more important takeaway is that this does matter to some extent in most contexts. Of course, one wonders what explains this variation across time and space. In this chapter, we argue that a key factor is the extent to which these issues are actually really salient in the public sphere, which is something that varies not just across countries, but across time. And for example, it could explain why this association seems to go up a little bit in 2014 and 2016, some years after the financial crisis. We think this is something to do with the dynamics of issue salience after a major crisis. At the outbreak of a financial crisis, the public sphere is dominated not by public services and things like that, but rather things having to do with financial regulations, bailouts, macroeconomic issues, management, perhaps after a while, impact on the real economy, austerity policies. And it takes a number of years to sort of turn the attention to the welfare state, to public services, the increased need for services and social policies that the crisis might have caused, but also the issue of how these services might have been affected by austerity policies and by the crisis. So that is the sort of issue attention dynamics over time are probably important. And now, final slide. This is a sort of a self-centered plug. If you're interested in issue dynamics, public sphere salience of these issues, this gives me an excuse to just mention this new book that was just published by myself and Achim Görres. And this book investigates sort of how political leaders publicly debate the challenges that the welfare state faces, but also how citizens kind of respond and draw political conclusions from such debate. And we also try to evaluate the answers to these questions in terms of normative democratic requirements and models. All right. And with that, I'll just say thank you and back to Bart.
Okay, thank you, Staffan. I think we'll leave it at this, and then looking at Eric now. Yeah.
Thanks, Bart, and thank you both of you. That was fascinating, very interesting indeed. The welfare modules have been very well used and are very much viewed as one of the best parts of ESS has done over the years. I have a little question I'd just like to throw out to you. It strikes me that some of the aspects of questions about welfare, in so much as they involve support for others, looking after the vulnerable, disadvantaged, sort of transfers of resources. I'm wondering, do you think there's any extent to which some of these items are potentially sort of socially desirable items? And in the context of that, as you know, Bart, we've got a debate going on about moving to self-completion. Do you think there's any sense in which, you know, we might possibly see that dial move a little bit in a different mode? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I think it would be the typical candidate for this kind of social desirability bias, where people, especially in front of an interviewer, would like to show how sociable they are as a person. On the other hand, when you look at a lot of results from surveys, I'm always surprised how strong the socially undesirable opinions are that are voiced. So I wonder if this would really be a huge issue or not. But it's certainly something to take care of if there is the switch to self-completion. I think not in the upcoming round, but the round after, there will be experiments with self-completion next to the face-to-face. And I also think that there is a couple of welfare state-related questions that would be good candidates for this kind of social desirability bias in the core module. So I think it's a good idea to look into this carefully.
Yeah, I've always wondered specifically about the status of questions that have anything to do with sort of pensions or sort of looking after the elderly, given the standard demographic of freelance interviewers.
Yes, indeed. It would be, I mean, we have the information on the interviewer age in some of the countries, I think, so it would be an interesting analysis. Yeah. What is also, it's not only social desirability bias, it's also, a lot of these questions, and hence the too rosy picture, a lot of these questions, they only mention the positive side. So would you like more benefits? And a lot of people would tend to agree with this. And then we know if there is more taxation mentioned as well as a consequence, that this has an impact on the general levels of support.
Thank you. I'm not seeing anything fresh in the Q&A box. So thank you very much, both of you, again, for your paper. That was excellent. And we'll move on and finish the session with our fourth paper, which is from Fabian at Warwick University in the UK. This relates to the topic of personal and social well-being. This is a module that's already been fielded in rounds 3 and round 6. And I think Mark's going to talk more prospectively about plans for the round 12 version. I will let him speak for himself. Welcome, Mark, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Eric. I'll just share my slides then. And then hopefully it doesn't go into presentation view. Can everyone see that fine?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So this proposal is joint with Frank Martella, who's at Alto, Antonella Della Fave at Milan, Gundi Nice, who's at actually I'm forgetting now, but it's a think tank in Germany or something of that sort, and Milena Nikolova, who's in Rotterdam, I think. So it's an interdisciplinary team: economics, psychology, medicine. I'm in public policy. Gundi is more kind of sociology, geography, and some economics. So really coming at it from a lot of different points of view. I'll talk a bit about why it's worth measuring well-being, why we maybe want a richer set of questions occasionally, at least, than what's in the core of the ESS and what's common to a lot of the big social surveys like Hilda or the SOAP. The academic debates in well-being that we hope some of the data that's available in the ESS and that we propose to collect will help to resolve. And then I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical framework we have in this module and the associated items. So on this question of why measure well-being, I guess the main thrust as far as I can tell, is kind of coming from the perception that is increasingly shared across academics and the public more generally and policymakers, that the kind of traditional economic ways of thinking about welfare are maybe a little bit played out. They don't seem to have quite as much power anymore to capture the things we care about. And there seem to be a lot of things that we care about increasingly that are not particularly well handled by economic measures of welfare. So the most obvious one is sustainability. Another bunch of stuff in there is things like happiness and various psychological states of mind, meaning and purpose, community, identity, kind of all the things that maybe you start to care about once you become rich. So this kind of question, all right, we're advanced nations now. What do we do with all this advancement that we've done? How do we leverage this to have good lives? And it doesn't seem to be the case that just getting more income is going to really do very much for that, especially if it comes at the cost of sustainability or people having very long work hours that make them unhappy, for example. I see quite a lot of enthusiasm for this sort of stuff in the policy domain, and this enthusiasm is accelerating. So we have New Zealand's first wellbeing budget a few years ago, and that's now quite institutionalized there. Obviously, Bhutan as well as an early mover in this space. The UK Treasury now has a Green Book supplement for wellbeing-based cost-effectiveness analysis, and we see a lot of efforts across lots of jurisdictions in the United Kingdom, Wales, Scotland, the Greater London Authority, the North of Tyne Authority, Northern Ireland, all trying to produce different wellbeing frameworks through which to understand the effectiveness of policy, the objectives of policy, and then measures of wellbeing through which we can evaluate that policy and try to think about optimal allocation of social resources. I think one aspect of this, kind of building on what I said on the previous slide, that is very prominent in a lot of European nations is the kind of consequences of deindustrialization. So some of that was mentioned in previous presentations today already, things like populism in places that have deindustrialized, kind of identitarian sentiment and the relationship with the refugee crisis, the COVID pandemic and what we saw coming out of that in terms of the importance of social capital and social cohesion. And a lot of these sort of themes are beyond the capacity of kind of mainstream economic ways of thinking about welfare to handle effectively. They can get some sort of traction on them, but I think even people very committed to welfare economics would concede that this is a difficult thing, and that maybe there is some complementary contribution that can come from other perspectives on well-being, such as those from sociology in particular and psychology. But all of this kind of stuff needs scientific support, and that brings me to this, I think, quite important issue, which is that within different academic disciplines and across those disciplines, there is very, very significant, at times acrimonious, but I think increasingly friendly, constructive debate about what well-being is and how it should be conceptualized and measured. So the traditional philosophical perspectives, which are probably least prominent in public policy debates, are whether the well-being is just getting what you desire, which is roughly the definition that economics uses, whether well-being is a mental state, which is the kind of definition that we see in psychology, although they usually emphasize mental states quite distinct from the ones philosophers emphasize. So philosophy tends to focus on pleasure. In development studies, you then have this focus more commonly on capabilities. So are you able to be the kind of person you want to be and do the sort of things that you want to do? And then we tend to measure that in objective ways. Psychology takes, as you'd expect, a more psychological perspective on what well-being is, so much more oriented around aspects of the mind. And then within hedonic and behavioral psychology, there's a focus more on evaluations and experiences. That's the sort of subjective well-being view that's quite common in a lot of social surveys. But increasingly within psychology, there's a bit of a debate where I suppose perspectives coming a bit more out of clinical psychology and out of the broader positive psychology literature argue that there are many other aspects of well-being that are not factored into that subjective well-being model, things like basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, meaning in life, coherence in life, a sense that you understand how the world works, and then things like Martin Seligman's PERMA framework. So that's positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And then there's also this view that I won't talk about any further after this, but I thought I'd put at least one bullet point in to acknowledge it, in part because this is my own view and this is what I'm presenting in other work. The political science view on how wellbeing public policy should proceed is to ask people what they think makes their life go well and how they think it should be measured. But that's not really something that the ESS has to worry about, I think. So just a little bit more detail on this debate within psychology, because a lot of what we are putting forward in this module is about trying to help this debate get further along, try not necessarily to resolve this debate, but to be able to contribute a lot more empirical evidence to help us sift through a lot of these conflicts. So there's this body of literature that I would call the field of subjective well-being, and that's distinct from the concept of subjective well-being. So subjective well-being is just how you think your life is going or how you experience your life is going. And then subjective well-being really operationalizes this as judgments about life satisfaction, judgments, and experiences of various moods. There's also more increasingly an emphasis on feelings of whether your life is worthwhile and maybe feelings of optimism. Very recently, there's been a bit more discussion about a new idea called psychological richness, but I think that's too early to say that we should be including it in something like the ESS. In contrast to that, you have this idea from Martin Seligman, the PERMA framework. It's a bit more, bit broader. So bringing in ideas like engagement or flow from Csikszentmihalyi, bringing in the notion, the importance of relationships to humans, very social animal, and then the sense of achievement and personal growth and these kind of things. More out of the clinical point of view, you have self-determination theory, which is an extremely influential theory of motivation, well-being, and a range of other issues that psychologists are interested in. And they tend to think of well-being as a complex sort of network that self-reinforces within human psychology, but the kind of basic ingredients are basic psychological needs, which I'll talk about a bit more in the future. And if people's basic psychological needs are being met, then you would tend to see subjective well-being, life satisfaction, mood, etc., as a sort of indicator of that basic psychological need satisfaction. Felicia Huppert, who was kind of the leader of the previous well-being module with the European Social Survey, has recently produced a new measure called the well-being profile, which is very much built on self-determination theory with some other ideas. Kind of includes all of the things that I've listed here under subjective well-being, PERMA, and self-determination theory. And then there's also a lot of interest in other variables that are related to, if not core to well-being, where the literature has matured quite substantially, and we think it would be very valuable to be able to study these things at a sociological scale rather than just in a laboratory. And so something like the European Social Survey would be very helpful to science in this regard. And those concepts include things like harmony, mindfulness, optimism, and then psychopathology, which we've always studied a bit in the ESS. So by that, I mean depression and anxiety. So one thing that's really worth underlining, I think, is that a lot of these psychological variables do not exist in the big social surveys that are the workhorses of this academic literature. So things like HILDA, which is the Household Income and Labour Dynamics of Australia survey, the German Socioeconomic Panel, the British Household Panel, the World Values Survey, these kind of things. A lot of these surveys do include some well-being questions, but they are very heavily influenced by that subjective well-being perspective, perhaps because of just how cheap it is to put a single life satisfaction question or a single job satisfaction question in, or perhaps because of the influence of economics over a lot of these surveys, and the only sort of well-being question that economics has countenanced in recent years is life satisfaction. So we have a lot of data globally on life satisfaction and some data on mood. We also have quite a lot of data on trust, social capital, on capabilities, on some of these kind of more objective questions, but we have very little data at a sociological scale, at an international scale, on this wider range of psychological variables. The ESS 2012 round, where Felicia had led the previous wellbeing module, I think is an extremely rare exception to this trend. So that's one of the only big data sets at sociological scale that has questions about meaning, basic psychological needs, and some of these other items. Now, I think that raises a real problem for the science, or the team thinks that it raises a real problem for the science. So with the variables that we currently have in these big social surveys, we can explain only, I would say, quite a low portion of the variance of life satisfaction. So I have some colleagues led by Kasper Kaiser and Katja Opperiner who've recently done a bunch of machine learning work to try to explain as much of the variance in life satisfaction as they can using all the objective variables in the German socioeconomic panel, and the highest R-squared they could get was around 0.3. And that leads me to think that most of the things that explain life satisfaction are not currently being measured in these big social surveys. So if we are interested in well-being, if we think it's something worth studying, then we should try to ask more of these questions. There's also then this controversy that subjective well-being and life satisfaction in particular is just not a very good way of defining psychological well-being, and that life satisfaction is not a particularly comprehensive measure of that broader concept of well-being. But we can't sort of really resolve that debate within psychology or even take it further, I think, until we have a wider array of large-scale, large N, internationally comparable data on all these other psychological variables that might contribute to well-being or might be definitive of well-being. So we need more data to take that debate forward. I think the policy debates, which I'm a public policy professor, I mostly work in the policy space, is heavily driven by the availability of data. There's much less of an interest in these kind of conceptual debates there. And so in that case, if the data that's available is life satisfaction, then that's what will determine policy. But if it is in fact the case that well-being is something more complex than that, then that policy might end up being weakened by the fact that we don't have the relevant data. Now, a lot of people are calling for more data, but usually what I hear in that is just more life satisfaction data. But as you see from the first bullet point, we're not very good at explaining life satisfaction. So I think in order to have a better understanding of that, even if we ultimately decide that life satisfaction is the thing we want to go with, in the meantime, we need to collect not just more life satisfaction data, but a wider variety of well-being data. Now, I think there are some papers using the previous round of the ESS that kind of undergird a lot of what I've just said. So I've put these three papers up here. You'll see some of the people on this team there. So Felicia Huppert in the second paper, who led the previous module, Frank Martella, who's leading this module, and Kai Ruggeri, who was Felicia's PhD student at Cambridge. I'll just share a few quick results from the first and third of these papers. So this is from Frank's recent paper with a bunch of other people, obviously, on basic psychological needs and their relationship to these other items that are usually associated with well-being. So we see that basic psychological needs is much more powerful at predicting happiness. So it's the experience of happiness. How happy were you experiencing a lot of happiness yesterday? Much more powerful at predicting that than income is. Income is actually quite trivial in its power. Similarly, basic psychological needs much more powerful at predicting life satisfaction. We tend to find that life satisfaction is very powerful if you don't have, that income is very powerful at predicting life satisfaction if you don't have a lot of income. But once you sort of achieve a kind of middle-class lifestyle, it really seems to lose its power. And most of the European countries are sort of quite well off. So then we start to need to be interested in what other things determine people's well-being within that sort of advanced nation context, and basic psychological needs seem to be a very strong candidate. They also have a very strong and pronounced relationship with meaning in life, again, much more so than income. And finally, they have this quite strong negative correlation with depression. So if your basic psychological needs are being met, then it's unlikely that you'll be experiencing depression and anxiety. This is really kind of the origins of the idea coming out of some of Richard Ryan and Ed Desi's clinical practice. So again, I think this is a variable that I think we really need to collect, and the ESS is pretty much the only place that currently does it. One last set of findings. This is now from the Ruggeri et al. Paper, just showing how much variation there can be even within countries around different aspects of well-being that various branches of psychology at least think are relevant to well-being. So you can see that there are some broad patterns, like the Scandinavian countries tend to do quite well on all of the different aspects of well-being, but there can also be quite substantial variation. So I've just pulled out Spain here with some red boxes. So you can see that it's not doing so well optimism and resilience, but then very, very well on engagement. Similarly, in the UK, really tanking on emotional stability, but curiously, I mean, it's somewhat contradictory, seems to be doing very well on resilience. And the UK also does quite well on positive relationships. So you can see that just next to the resilience column, which I take to be quite encouraging. And then if you look at Ukraine, Ukraine has so much volatility. I find like Ukraine is often doing relatively low in the rankings on engagement, meaning, positive emotions, even resilience. But I suspect that this is all from the 2012 data. So I suspect that given recent events, Ukraine's resilience is much higher now. But back in the previous wave, they were doing quite well on emotional stability and optimism. We tend to find that developing countries tend to be more optimistic in a lot of cases. So this, I think, just kind of brings home the idea that there is a lot of variation across these different aspects of well-being, and we can learn a lot about the quality of life broadly conceived in these different nations if we have this kind of rich data about well-being, not just life satisfaction. Okay. So as I said, the ESS has the necessary questions for this kind of analysis, and that's true. That's only really true of the ESS. The other big social surveys don't have it. And so our hope is really just to repeat the 2012 module with only a few tweaks given science that has happened in the interim, rather than sort of really proposing something dramatically new. So the theoretical framework that sits behind what we're talking about, it was a little bit difficult to develop because, as I alluded, there's a lot of controversy and debate, even within disciplines, let alone across disciplines, regarding what well-being is and how it should be measured. And I'm very grateful to the rest of the team. I think they were all very open to having these discussions and trying to find some kind of framework that would allow us to proceed and just contribute to that debate and contribute to that science, rather than trying to solve the conceptual framework within our own team and then kind of impose it on anyone who might want to use this module. So we're really looking to include a wide range of questions that can facilitate debate, rather than ask questions to get specific answers. We don't have necessarily a research agenda specifically, rather we want to see just kind of more people with different ideas come in and use the rich data that's available in the European Social Survey. Traditionally, the ESS, I think, has collected really good data on objective determinants of well-being, so things like income, trust, access to healthcare, the welfare state stuff that we've already heard about. What we are proposing is to collect more data on the subjective or psychological elements of well-being. So the conceptual framework that we have is the following. I think it would be a little bit hard to really explain or defend this within, maybe I don't need to go, but this doesn't, there are many different psychological frameworks, or many different frameworks around what well-being is embedded in this broader model, because we're trying to be conciliatory. So it's as coherent as we can make it, but I think there'd be interesting ways to critique or amend the labels that we've used in particular. So broadly, we think there's this kind of macro factors that we call social well-being. You could also put a bunch of other macro factors like income and health in there, but we're focused more on the social side because that's traditionally been part of the social and psychological well-being module. So things like social cohesion, trust, harmony, whether people feel respected, whether they have friends or they're lonely, and whether they're feeling safe, which is a new item that we propose. And then once those kind of macro conditions are set, people interact with those macro conditions through their psychological functioning, which includes their basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And I'll define those in a bit more detail momentarily. And then their what we're calling their mental resources. So resilience, mindfulness, self-compassion, optimism, and pro-social tendencies. So you can think of these mental resources as like people's well-being skills or their capacities to live their life in a way that will bring them well-being. And then assuming that both psychological functioning and social well-being are being taken care of, then we would expect people's perceptions of their own well-being to be broadly positive. Whereas if psychological functioning and social well-being are weak, then we would expect people's perceptions of their own well-being to also be negative. And then the perceived well-being we split in the typical subjective well-being manner between affective well-being, or what we might call experiences of well-being. So this mood states, positive affect and negative affect, and then a few other items there, vitality, we have a depression scale, and anxiety. On the other hand, we have the evaluative well-being, which is then the standard, are you satisfied with your life? Do you feel like you have meaning in your life? And we're also proposing a new question around inner harmony. All right, I'm going to talk about some of the questions we're using, but I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think the wording is all pretty standard in most cases and is really just repeating from the previous module. I'm going to focus on what new items we suggest adding. So we want to have mood state questions to capture some of the experienced well-being, and the classic ones are happiness, enjoyment, calm and peaceful, and lots of energy. And we propose to add to that one from the depression scale, or rather to repeat one from the depression scale about sadness. We want to retain the question on vitality, which is about how much energy you had. This is a big part of self-determination theory. We also propose to repeat all 8 of the previous depression scale questions, although we have got some advice from the OECD that they have found that, I believe it's called the PCQ, but that a 4-item scale has really done almost as well as this 8-item scale, and that would free up some questions for us to ask about other items. So we maintain an anxiety question. We have the standard life satisfaction scale question. On the meaning side, we try to broaden out a little bit. So we're going to repeat the, I generally feel that what I do in my life is valuable and worthwhile. So we think here we're capturing a sense of purpose in life and maybe significance as well. But in the 3-factor model of well-being, of meaning in life that has really come out in positive psychology starting from about 2006, there's also a question about coherence, which is sort of whether the world feels like it's making sense, which has been implicated in some of the populism stuff as well. And to try to have a question that we hope captures more of this general feeling of meaning that includes both purpose and coherence and significance, we are proposing to replace this previous question that had weak psychometric properties with a new question, I experience much meaning in my life. It's this new body of research on inner harmony. So there are 3 kinds of harmony in a sense. There's how sort of harmonious you feel within yourself. So how well the different aspects of your personality and your values and these kind of things all fit together and make sense. No dissonance, you might think of it that way. And then there's also your harmony with other people and your harmony with the world more broadly. So think of environment in particular. And so drawing on that research, we're posing one question, which is more related to inner harmony, and that's that you experience balance and harmony in your life. Then we have the 3 basic psychological needs questions. As I said, this is a very prominent body of work, thousands of papers, hundreds of thousands of citations, extremely influential, but not really able to be studied that well yet at a sociological scale. So there are 3 basic psychological needs. Autonomy is a sense of volition, self-endorsement, an internal locus of causality. Competence is a sense of efficacy and self-mastery, especially with respect to skills that you value. So if you don't think that a skill is something that you really need, it won't bother you that you're not competent with it. It's really about whether you think that that skill is important. And then relatedness is a sense of being loved and cared for, and generally a measure, a concept relating to the strength of our social ties. So for the autonomy question, we repeating questions from previous modules. So are you free to decide how to live your life? And to what extent do you make time to do the things that you really want to do? For competence, we have a sense of accomplishment, opportunities to show how competent we are, and then that you're generally doing things that you are good at. So not so much whether you're doing things that you want to do, that would be autonomy, but things that you're good at. And then relatedness, we have a range of questions that are complementary with some of the social well-being questions about how many people you have to discuss intimate affairs with, whether you have help and support, whether you take part in social activities, and whether you hang out with your friends. Going on then to the mental resources section, we have resilience. So there was a previous question in the 2012 module that framed resilience as a coping strategy. And the science has kind of moved on a bit from that way of conceptualizing it to more of a bouncing forward conception, that when you face adversity, you kind of not just overcome it or deal with it, but actually thrive under that adversity. So the new question we are proposing is, when things go wrong in my life, I generally find something good that helps me to thrive. On mindfulness, we are repeating a question from the previous module. On a typical day, how often do you take notice of and appreciate your surroundings? And then we also have a new measure to try to capture non-reactivity, which is one of the kind of most significant aspects of mindful people. So we have this question: in difficult situations, I can pause without immediately reacting. This kind of suggests that you have a capacity to metacognate and that you're not being tossed around by your emotions. For self-compassion, we have to propose new items. So we have, I try to see my failings as part of the human condition. And when I'm going through a very hard time, I give myself the care and tenderness that I need. Optimism, we are repeating a question from an earlier module that's a pretty standard question. Pro-social tendencies, we are also repeating mostly questions from a previous round, but we are also adding a new question. When I hear about someone going through a difficult time, I feel a great deal of compassion for them. So here we are complementing our earlier self-compassion questions with a question about compassion for others, which might be interesting in some ways to people looking at immigrants or refugees and that sort of thing. Speaking of which, we come then to the social well-being questions. So again, repeating mostly from previous waves, but we wanted to add a new question on online social cohesion, given that online spaces have become so much more prominent in the last decade and are such a big part of a lot of the political things that we see these days. So we have this question: how much social support do you receive on social media and online more generally? Quite curious to see what we find there. Repeating the core trust questions. And then for social harmony, so we talked about personal harmony or inner harmony previously. For social harmony, we have this question: it is important to maintain harmony within my society, and we are looking at extent of agreement with that phrasing. We're repeating the respect question from the previous module and from the core. And then we have a new question on safety, which is: I feel safe and protected against various threats in my life, which again may be interesting with respect to the migration stuff that we heard about earlier. Repeating the loneliness question, and that's the end of the module. I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Mark. That was a very intriguing little glimpse into the future. I can foresee some interesting conversations with regard to translation, things like harmony and compassion and stuff. But that's all plenty of things to look forward to in the times ahead. So thanks for that. That was very interesting. Just a sort of personal observation. I presume that the space you're having to make for some of these items is you made no reference to the items that relate to the so-called 5 ways to well-being, which are they're not states, are they? They're more sort of behavioural or reported actions by respondents in terms of sort of getting involved, connecting. Can't remember what the rest of the 5 were. That was a very specific policy moment, possibly. So, do you have any reflection on any of that?
I'll go back and have a look. We had a bit of difficulty when we were drafting the questions that we were proposing, understanding sort of how much space we had and what was in the core module as opposed to in the wellbeing module, and what the views of the ESS would be around how flexible things were there. So it might be that we just didn't realize that those questions were sort of part of our module or something like that. I think those sound like quite good items in terms of what we sometimes call like wellbeing competencies. So whether people have like good mental hygiene, you might speak of it that way, and yeah, whether their behavioral stuff is generally conducive to their well-being. So I think, yeah, if they are in our module, then I suspect we will want to retain them.
Yeah. There's a question from Isabella, which is kind of something that was on my mind. I think that the nub of it is this sort of, I think the question is whether online social support is comparable to in-person friend support. And could you tease out a little bit more of that conceptual difference for us?
Sure. I mean, I guess my suspicion is no. I'm not an expert on online social support, and there are cases where certain communities can only exist online, so they're niche interests, and so it's quite hard for them to emerge in person, particularly if you live in a smaller area or something like that, where there's just not the scale to support a community of interest in that thing. But in terms of like general social support, having friends and that sort of thing, yeah, I'm skeptical that an online friend would be as significant to your well-being as in-person friends. But I guess that's the empirical question. So if we have data on whether people are receiving online support and whether people are receiving in-person support, then we can start to cut that data pretty easily to see the relationship between that and different facets of well-being.
I think certainly judging by the number of my undergraduates who want to do things around social media exposure and mental health / well-being, it seems pretty timely introduction, really.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, definitely the young people Instagram phenomenon and its relationship with poor mental health, especially in girls, is, I think, pretty well established now.
Yeah.
But I don't know if Instagram, like people do seem to use Instagram for messaging each other, but I'm not sure whether they see it as a social support venue. But I'm not sure what the social support platforms are online. Like as an academic, I used to get quite a lot from Twitter. It's now much more dead than it used to be. And then Reddit is a community for some people, but I don't know what's kind of replaced sort of chat rooms where people used to go, like Discord servers and that sort of thing might be quite important sources of support for a lot of people, or sources of community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that. We look forward to working with you in the future. So I'll round up the event by just thanking everybody for who's attended online, or at least some of the session, and just to remind you that these talks will be available in due course on our YouTube channel, and remind you again that we have more events forthcoming as part of the 20th birthday celebrations. We'll be having events focusing specifically on the use of the SS as a 20-year time series that they'll be happening in April, May, and June. So keep your eye on the normal, all the usual places for information about that. So for now, it's thank you to everybody both speaking and attending, and good afternoon.